Story number 1.
Classmate won't listen to input and gets humbled. Hi, this is my first Reddit story, so bear with me. For context, at the time, I, 20F, had just started school to become a motorcycle technician. This story takes place during the first class, after the basic introductory courses, which meant we were finally diving into hands-on work. I was excited, but also a little nervous, since this was my first real step into the field I was so passionate about. There was another girl in the class who was about my age. Let's call her Sarah. Since we were the only 2 women in the class, it seemed natural for us to team up. Having a partner wasn't mandatory, but it was highly recommended. Plus, I thought it would be nice to have some camaraderie in what was a very male-dominated environment. From the start, it was clear Sarah had a big personality. To be fair, so do I, but her energy was, let's say, overpowering. I figured we could find a balance and make it work, so I tried to stay optimistic. The dirt bike lift fiasco. Our first lab assignment involved working on dirt bikes. Compared to other motorcycles, they're much lighter, which is why they're commonly used in beginner labs. Simple enough, right? Well, not quite. We needed to get the dirt bike onto the lift to start. As I prepared to line it up, I noticed it wasn't positioned quite right. To fix this, I started to lift the rear tire to adjust its placement, just like you would when putting it on a dirt bike stand. This was something I had done countless times before, and I knew how to lift it properly without risking injury. But the moment Sarah saw me lifting the bike, she freaked out. "That's so bad for your back," she exclaimed, looking genuinely horrified. She then launched into a whole lecture about how unsafe it was, throwing in anecdotes about her dad being a seasoned motorcycle technician for years. I understood where she was coming from, sort of, but her reaction felt over the top. If you lift with proper form, it's perfectly safe. I don't enjoy confrontation and will avoid it whenever possible, so I decided not to argue. Instead, I started awkwardly maneuvering the bike using a series of 3-point turns. It was frustrating because this was exactly the type of inefficiency I was trying to avoid. The whole point was to save time and energy so we could move on to the actual lab work. By the time the bike was finally on the lift, I was already irritated. Round 2. The stand debate. Once the front end of the bike was clamped to the lift, we needed to place a dirt bike stand under its frame for stability. I asked Sarah to help by positioning the stand while I lifted the rear tire again. Predictably, this suggestion didn't go over well. She protested loudly, insisting it wasn't safe for me to lift the bike even though I was the one volunteering to do it. Before I could even attempt to convince her otherwise, she called the teacher over for help. At this point, I was trying not to roll my eyes. We hadn't even started the actual lab yet, and we were already falling behind because of all this unnecessary back and forth. When the teacher arrived, he assessed the situation and instructed me to lift the rear tire while Sarah positioned the stand. Exactly what I had suggested in the first place. I couldn't help but give Sarah a blank stare, though internally, I was laughing. I guess she trusted the teacher's word more than mine. The shock adjustment saga with the bike finally secure, we moved on to the actual task, adjusting the rear shock. This involved setting the adjustment nut to a specific measurement, then tightening the lock nut to hold it in place. Straightforward enough, right? Apparently not. Sarah misunderstood the instructions and became fixated on the idea that the lock nut itself had its own separate specification. I tried to explain that the service manual clearly stated the lock nut's job was simply to tighten against the adjustment nut. That's it. But she wasn't having it. Instead of trusting me, or even double-checking the manual, she decided to ask every other student in the class. Yes, every single one. One by one, they all told her the same thing I had. Meanwhile, I stood there waiting, biting my tongue to keep from saying something snarky. If she didn't want to trust my input, fine. But why not just go straight to the teacher instead of wasting so much time? Eventually, Sarah did ask the teacher, who confirmed exactly what I'd been saying all along. I felt vindicated, but also exasperated. By the time we finished the lab, we were way behind the other students. Normally, I would have been ahead, but her constant second-guessing had turned a simple task into a marathon. The aftermath. After that lab, Sarah and I silently agreed to avoid working together in the future. We never discussed it explicitly, but it was clear neither of us wanted to repeat that experience. It was like an unspoken truce. You do your thing, and I'll do mine. Looking back, I can see how her intentions might have been good, but her approach was exhausting. Trust and collaboration are so important in a partnership, and without them, things just fall apart. At least I learned a valuable lesson. Sometimes it's better to go solo than to deal with unnecessary drama.
Story number 2.
The shadow in the window. Holly had always loved her apartment. It was a cozy third-floor unit in an old brick building with tall windows that let in the morning sun. The view wasn't much, a quiet street and the brick facade of the building across the way. But it was hers. She often left her blinds open at night, enjoying the occasional glimpse of the stars. It was peaceful, or so she thought. One evening, as she sat on the couch scrolling through her phone, something caught her eye. A shadow passed across the window in the building across from her. It was quick but unmistakable, a figure moving behind the curtains of the apartment directly opposite hers. She didn't think much of it at first. People lived their lives, they moved around their homes, but over the next few nights the shadow appeared again. And again. At first, Holly assumed it was her neighbor. She hadn't met anyone from that apartment, but the figure always moved in the same way. Slow, deliberate pacing back and forth. Then one night, curiosity got the better of her. She decided to watch. She turned off her lights, making it harder for anyone to see her from outside, and settled near the window. The figure appeared, as it always did, but something was off. It didn't seem like a person. The way it moved was strange, jittery, almost unnatural. She leaned closer, her breath fogging the glass. And then the shadow stopped. It turned toward her as if it knew she was watching. A chill ran down Holly's spine. She pulled the blinds shut and tried to brush it off. "It's just someone messing around," she muttered to herself. But that night she had trouble sleeping. Every time she closed her eyes, she imagined the shadow standing in the window staring at her. The next day, she asked her landlord about the neighbors across the way. "Oh, that unit?" he said, frowning. "No one's lived there for years. It's been empty since I took over the building." Holly laughed nervously. "That's impossible. I've seen someone moving around in there." The landlord shook his head. "It's probably a reflection. Happens all the time in old windows." But Holly wasn't convinced. That night she couldn't resist looking again. She opened her blinds just a crack, peering out into the darkness. The shadow was there, waiting. This time it didn't pace. It stood still, perfectly still, in the window opposite hers. And it was staring directly at her. Holly's heart raced. She shut the blinds again and grabbed her phone. She called her best friend, Cassie, and told her everything. "Come over," Cassie said. "You shouldn't be alone." Holly agreed, grateful for the company. She double-checked her locks and tried to distract herself until Cassie arrived. But the shadow didn't leave her mind. When Cassie finally showed up, Holly felt a wave of relief. She led her to the window, explaining what she'd seen. Cassie peeked through the blinds, frowning. "I don't see anything." Holly looked for herself. The window was dark. Empty. "I swear it was there," Holly insisted. Cassie stayed the night, and for the first time in days, Holly slept without checking the window. But in the early hours of the morning, she woke with a start. Cassie was standing by the window, her back to Holly, the blinds pulled open. "Cassie," Holly whispered. Cassie didn't respond. Holly got out of bed, her heart pounding. She reached for her friend's shoulder. As she turned Cassie around, she froze. Cassie's eyes were wide, unblinking, her face pale and expressionless. Her lips moved silently, mouthing words Holly couldn't hear. And then, from behind her, Holly saw it. The shadow. It wasn't in the window anymore, it was standing in her apartment. The next morning, the landlord found the apartment empty. Holly and Cassie were gone, their phones and belongings left untouched. The only thing out of place was Holly's window. The blinds had been pulled open, and on the glass, written in the fog of breath, was a single word: watching. From then on, the neighbors swore they saw movement in Holly's apartment at night, shadows pacing back and forth as if waiting for someone to look too closely.
Story number 3.
The Forgotten Trail. Deep in the woods behind the sleepy town of Glenridge was an old hiking trail, long abandoned and overgrown. The locals called it the Forgotten Trail and warned against venturing there. The stories varied. Some spoke of hikers disappearing without a trace, others of eerie whispers that led people deeper into the forest until they were hopelessly lost. But the most unsettling legend was about the Watcher, a figure said to stalk anyone brave or foolish enough to tread the trail after sunset. When James and his friends heard the tales, they laughed them off. They were city kids visiting Glenridge for the weekend, and a creepy hike sounded like the perfect way to kill time. "This'll be fun," James said, slinging his backpack over his shoulder. They had no idea what awaited them. The entrance to the trail was marked by an old wooden sign, its paint faded and peeling. "Stay on the path," it read, though the words were barely legible. James led the group, followed by Claire, Max, and Lila. The woods were eerily quiet, the usual sounds of birds and insects replaced by an unsettling stillness. The deeper they went, the darker it became. The trees seemed to close in around them, their gnarled branches forming a canopy that blocked out the sun. "Creepy, but kinda cool," Max said, snapping pictures on his phone. "Let's go a little farther," James urged, ignoring the uneasy looks from Claire and Lila. About an hour into the hike, they came across something strange. A shoe, old and weathered, lay in the middle of the path. "That's weird," Lila said, picking it up. "Probably just some hiker who lost it," James said, but his voice lacked conviction. As they moved on, they found more items: a torn backpack, a water bottle covered in moss, a rusted flashlight. "It's like someone just left all their stuff here," Claire whispered. Max's phone buzzed. He frowned. No service. They all checked their phones. No bars. "We should head back," Lila said, her voice trembling. But when they turned around, the trail behind them was gone. The path had vanished, replaced by dense underbrush and towering trees that seemed to have appeared out of nowhere. "That's not possible," James muttered, panic creeping into his voice. They tried retracing their steps, but the forest twisted around them, leading them in circles. And then they heard it, a soft rustling like footsteps coming from the trees. "Probably an animal," Max said, though his voice shook. But the rustling grew louder, closer, accompanied by a faint whispering. The group froze. What is that?" Claire whispered, her eyes wide. The whispers were unintelligible, but they seemed to be calling, luring them deeper into the woods. James grabbed a stick and waved it in front of him, trying to look braver than he felt. "Let's stick together and keep moving. We'll find the main trail eventually." But the forest seemed endless, each step pulling them farther from where they thought they'd come. Suddenly Max stopped. "Do you see that?" He pointed to a shadowy figure standing between the trees. It was tall and thin, its face obscured, its body unnaturally still. "Who's there?" James called out. The figure didn't move. The group backed away slowly, but the figure seemed to follow, always just out of reach of the dim light filtering through the trees. It wasn't walking. It was gliding, its movements smooth and silent. "Run!" James shouted. They took off, weaving through the trees, their breaths ragged and their hearts pounding. But no matter how far or fast they ran, the figure was always there, waiting for them just ahead. And the whispers grew louder. Finally, they stumbled into a small clearing. In the center was a stone altar, covered in strange symbols. "What the hell is this?" Lila gasped. James approached it cautiously, his eyes scanning the strange markings. "It's old," he said. "Really old." But before they could inspect it further, the whispers stopped. The silence was deafening. Then, from the shadows, the figure emerged. It was closer now, its features partially visible. Its face was pale, its eyes dark pits that seemed to swallow the light. "You shouldn't be here," it said, its voice low and echoing. The group froze, too terrified to move. "We're lost," James managed to say, his voice trembling. The figure tilted its head as if considering them. "Leave," it said, "but leave something behind." The friends exchanged panicked glances. "What does it mean?" Lila whispered. Before anyone could answer, the figure pointed at the altar. James stepped forward, his hands shaking. He placed his backpack on the stone. The figure didn't move. One by one, the others followed, leaving behind their phones, water bottles, even jewelry. When they were done, the figure stepped back into the shadows. The whispers returned, guiding them back to the trail. Hours later, they stumbled out of the woods, disoriented but alive. When they looked back, the entrance to the trail was gone, replaced by an unbroken line of trees. They never spoke of what happened, but none of them ever ventured near the woods again. Years later, hikers reported seeing strange items on the trail: a phone, a bracelet, a backpack, each one untouched and covered in moss. And in the deepest parts of the woods, some swore they heard whispers,